Welcome back, everyone. We're going to have a great discussion. It's a wonderful episode, lots to talk about. And I understand Larry Krasner is with us tonight. So we have we have some time to hear from him and to talk about some of the issues in the episode. For those of you who missed the brief introductions in the beginning, my name is Jim Nolan. I'm a professor at WVU, and I teach and conduct research on the topic of crime and social control. My emphasis is the institution of policing, and frequently draw on my personal experiences as a police officer in Wilmington, Delaware, and as the FBI unit chief. As I mentioned before, I'm the moderator for tonight's discussion, and Danielle Stoneberg is with me. She's a doctoral student in sociology, and Keely Wildman is a graduate student in social work. And they'll co-moderate with me, and they'll help me manage the questions in the chat. Before we get started, I want to briefly introduce this panel. We have Mr. Krasner, of course. Mr. Krasner, would you prefer Larry, or how would you want us to reference you?
Larry's great, thank you.
All right, thanks, Larry. Larry Krasner is district attorney for the city of Philadelphia. He graduated from the University of Chicago and then Stanford Law School before returning to Philadelphia. Since his first term in January 2018, he's worked to reform the criminal justice system and provide greater transparency and accountability in policing. He was reelected to a second term in 2021. Darren Lester is a graduate student in the School of Social Work at WVU. He's recently honored with the Hometown Hero Award by the organization West Virginia Can't Wait. Collectively, Darren has spent over 20 years in various prisons in Virginia and West Virginia, and was recently released in June 2021 after serving 11 and a half years. While incarcerated, he and co-founder Harold Davis developed the Olive Tree Initiative, a community-based accountability program for incarcerated people that encourage change through education. Their initiative has had over 375 graduates since its inception in 2014. The next panel member is Errol Randall, is a retired 25-year veteran of the Charleston, West Virginia Police Department, where he served as the department's strategic planning officer, FBI gang task force officer, street crimes unit detective, and patrol officer. As a strategic planning officer, Earl was tasked with developing and implementing 21st century community policing strategies, innovative reentry partnerships, and neighborhood revitalization efforts. Earl currently serves as the community outreach specialist for the state of West Virginia's Department of Military Affairs and Public Safety and the Department of Education. And Kyle Bass is an investigative journalist whose work has been featured in The Guardian and on several NPR shows, including Marketplace and The World. He runs Dragline, a nonprofit news organization that focuses on criminal justice reform and government accountability in West Virginia. Kyle spent the last 6 months focusing entirely on the 10 regional jails in our state and addressing civil rights violations. So we're fortunate to have this distinguished panel with us tonight, and we look forward to a great discussion. Again, we're here to discuss the episode of Philly DA and to consider some of the implications for West Virginia. So it's an opportunity to reimagine the police and the criminal justice system in West Virginia. With that in mind, if it's okay, why don't we start with the West Virginia representatives on the panel. After they provided some insights, perhaps Mr. Krasner or Larry will tell us a little bit about his efforts in Philadelphia and what his experiences might mean for reforms in West Virginia. So remember, Danielle and Keely will be fielding the chat comments. So please feel free to enter them in the chat. So let's start with Darren Lester. Would you mind sharing a little about yourself and your experiences and what the Philly DA episode meant to you?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Nolan. My name is Darren Lester, and good evening, everyone. This episode is quite disturbing for me on several levels. First and foremost is the fact that as I begin to look at Philly DA and all of the aspects of it all, what I'm seeing is a war of sorts. It's a war of sorts, whereas the police department is just totally set against accountability. They do not, or just believe that they have no accountability, and that because they are police officers, able to do the things that they do, and no one is supposed to question them. It's an interesting point because our country is based upon checks and balances, and I think Mr. Krasner is in an absolute great position to begin that discussion. Who watches the police? Who police the police? You know, we give so much away in terms of when we don't value everyone in our society. And as I'm listening to the FOP and the things that they are discussing and the things that they're saying, what they're saying basically is that a police officer life or his job or his career is more important than a Black man. It's more important than his life. And so these behaviors continue to perpetuate themselves throughout America, whether or not we're talking about Amir Locke, whether or not we're talking about Walter Scott, whether or not we're talking about, you know, the myriads of men and women of color who are consistently, I'm gonna say it for what it is, being assassinated by police officers in the disguise that they're in fear of their life. The fact of the matter is that this officer had already paralyzed one man beforehand. You would think consciously that a person who had did that, whether or not that was justified or not, would have some type of feeling and sense of shooting someone in the back and paralyzing them for the rest of their life. And only to find out that looking at, and I don't know all the evidence, and I won't try to expound upon that, but the fact is maybe if that case would have been handled properly the way that it was before, that David Jones would still be alive. It's an interesting concept how this thing continues to perpetuate itself. And speaking from a position of someone who's been in prison, and I don't claim to be no innocent man. I don't do that. I'm completely transparent with this. What I do know is that of the 2.5 million people who are incarcerated in this country, if we look at that and you think about that in terms of children who are left without fathers and mothers, you're looking at about a criminal justice system that's affecting anywhere from 10 to 12 million people. These are people and citizens who don't have mothers and fathers at home, that perpetuates that whole cycle of the criminal justice system over and over and over again. So it's disturbing to me. This thing about you know, allowing police officers, and I'm not trying, I got to digress because I'm not trying to you know, discredit a whole industry. But if we've got corrupt or immoral lawyers and doctors and teachers or plumbers or mechanics, whatever have you, why would we not believe that we've got police officers who do the same thing? Just because you put on a uniform, that doesn't make you moral. That doesn't make you ethical. Those things are internal. And because the human condition is what it is, we make mistakes. Unfortunately, for our mistakes, we have to be accountable for our mistakes. And accountability demands an element of justice. That doesn't mean revenge. It means justice. Sweeping things under the rug, lying about it, discrediting it, covering for it, that behavior cannot persist in this society. It just can't do it. So it's disturbing. I applaud you, Mr. Krasner. I applaud your work. That's just, man, it's revolutionary, and I'm grateful for what you do. The issue of mass incarceration is something that's near and dear to my heart, and so you know, I believe in redemption. There are people who are in this chat now. There are people, you know, around the country who believed in me. And so I definitely believe in it. And there's nothing special about me. So, I know that people can make changes. I know that they can turn themselves around if given the chance and given the opportunity. So that's a very important aspect, and I applaud you for doing that. I applaud you, Dr. Nolan, for putting on this panel. It's a very informative and much needed discussion that has to take place throughout our communities. It's not a us against them. It's not a black against white. I noticed that in the film that you were seeing it. If you look at the racial makeup of the people, and it just perpetuates that same idea that it's us against them, it's black against white, it's this one against that, it's that against that. And the fact of the matter is that regardless of who you are or what you are, whatever side, everybody knows somebody at some time that has some dealing with police. So it's a thing that affects the whole community, all of us. And as soon as we join hands together on this, we can be able to maybe make some changes. And I think all of us hold a piece of the answer. Not one of us has it. The police officers don't have it. The parole officer don't have it. The courts doesn't have it. But we all do. The community, black, white, rich, poor, Christian, Jew, Muslim, whatever. We've got to hold this thing together. We make ourselves say that we're the land of the free and the home of the brave, and that's simply not true. When you can kill a person out of fear of what you think he might do when there's no evidence, that's not brave. That's called cowardness. That's not brave. And home of the free, we know that's not free with 2.5 million people incarcerated. So these things are elements that need to be addressed. Thank you so much.
Darren, thanks so much. That was wonderful. Errol Randall, what are some of your observations from the program? And as a former police officer, what are some of the things that you draw from this that may help us think about reforming the profession?
Yes, sir. Dr. Nolan, I greatly appreciate being here to the panel. Mr. Krasner, thank you for attending. And as Dr. Nolan said, I'm a 25-year veteran, retired veteran of the Charleston Police Department, Charleston, West Virginia Police Department. And upon my observations, many things. As a matter of fact, I wrote 2.5 pages of notes and could have written more, but my mind is swimming. There were so many things that came to light. What I won't do, out of respect of the case, because I don't know the disposition or anything that has happened since this particular portion of the documentary, I will speak in general of some observations that are very important. First of all, we must form relationships and have meaningful relationships prior to incidents like this happening. That's what's important. We can't wait till an incident like this occurs and then call ourselves coming to the table and being able to really move forward in a meaningful way. We have to have relationships when times are quote unquote good, or let me say uneventful. Okay, very important, very important. And then when we do, let's figure out where we have common ground, because I guarantee you, from Mr. Krasner's office perspective, and also from the FOP, that the common ground was, I bet neither one of those folks or those offices want cops that discredit the profession. So let's build upon that, okay, as we move forward. Another thing that came to light was, wow, when the training officer spoke about and read from policy, he talked about honoring folks and the dignity of the people that they serve. One thing that he did not say was that we're only going to serve those folks that look like us or have our way of thinking. That was not said, but there's a phenomenon in law enforcement that we have to address, and have to address right now. And now is the time. And it's called unconscious biases. We all have them. We all have them. And once we realize that we all have them and the divisiveness that those unconscious biases can cause, man, that again is something again that we can use to move forward on. So how can we overcome our unconscious biases, especially in law enforcement? By doing what we're implementing here in West Virginia. And I'm very proud to announce that we are teaching emotional intelligence to our law enforcement officers. What is emotional intelligence? It's your ability to recognize and understand emotions, and your skill at using this awareness to manage yourself and your relationship with others. That's what policing is all about. It's about your relationship that you form over while working, those brief interactions. You know, we have to make sure that we appreciate every time that we make contact with someone. There's a quote by Stephen Covey. It's one of my favorite quotes of all time, and it goes like this: "Are we busy, or are we effective?" Man, we need to be effective, because nowhere in that policy did it say we're only going to police those folks that have our same political ideology, that have the same skin colors as I do, live in the same neighborhood as I do. No, unfortunately, that's how unconscious biases work. We don't know we have them, okay? But we do have them. All of us do, regardless of what our profession is. But with emotional intelligence, there are areas that are measured that we take appraisals for. And those areas that we measure are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship management. Man, oh man, oh man. When you are given a tool in which you have introspection of yourself, oh my goodness, you can't change what you don't know about. So we are so proud to announce that as of February of last year, every officer that's being trained in our police academy, regardless if you're a municipal officer or state trooper, everybody's receiving emotional intelligence training. And what it does is it helps us to achieve appropriate outcomes. That's what it does. And unlike IQ, EQ can change us. Our emotional intelligence, our internal emotional intelligence can change, but with training. So what we're doing, as well as we're proposing to law enforcement agencies, these are the core classes that you need to have and make mandatory. Kinesics, the study of body language. You know, when we communicate, 55% of our message is through body language. 38% is through how it's said, and only 7% is actually what it said. So if we can give training, meaningful training, not just those trainings that are going to allow us to get our necessary hours that we need throughout the year, but meaningful trainings that are going to help us to become culturally competent. That's the key to moving forward as in policing, and for us to be effective. And you're not going to just only, you know, your unconscious biases can again become more suppressed, or you can help, or actually you can overcome them by these practices, by mastering your emotional intelligence. But again, I'm gonna end with this. We have an equation, and it's EI plus SI equals CC. And that is our equation moving forward. Emotional intelligence, learning who you are, what drives your decision making, plus social intelligence, which is having these core classes which cover both emotional intelligence as well as becoming a well-rounded police officer. And again, we just feel that with those things combined, we become culturally competent, and we serve and we're more effective. Thank you.
Thank you, Earl. It's very helpful to think about it that way. I often talk about policing as being confused with the profession of policing being confused with the law enforcement approach. That the police and law enforcement they're used synonymously, incorrectly synonymously, and it creates like a language trap. That when you think about policing reform, you think about law enforcement reform and how to do law enforcement better. But reimagining policing could also be, how do we rethink, what are the police supposed to accomplish? Not just what they're supposed to do, what are they supposed to accomplish? And this is, you know, what reminded me was the Stephen Covey quote. What are we supposed to actually achieve by doing what we do? So thank you very much for that.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Mr. Vass, your perspective as a journalist, investigative journalist, is really important for us. Would you like to weigh in on the episode and what are the implications for West Virginia? From your perspective?
Yeah, one of the things I really enjoyed about watching, I've seen this whole series start to finish, and one thing that I really appreciated about it is that when we talk about criminal justice reform or we talk about policing, we often divide that, and when we talk about it theoretically, we divide it into different parts, but when we talk about it in pop culture, we usually are just talking about police officers, right? But within society, within this realm of policing, we have laws, we have police officers, and that hierarchy, the fraternal order of police, which we saw, which a lot of people don't think about day to day. We have prosecutors, such as Mr. Krasner, judges, and even the Department of Corrections. Like, where do these people go if they're found guilty? Or in West Virginia, if they can't afford bail, they often just get sent to our already overcrowded jails. But I would say my perspective differs a little bit from Mr. Randall's perspective, as far as thinking that we need accountability, and to lead with accountability. And again, not to speak for Mr. Randall, I'm just providing kind of another approach to criminal justice and police reform. Right, we have training on one hand, but I question a lot of times some of what this training accomplishes as far as outcomes. It kind of reminds me sometimes of like the DARE program or the Just Say No program in schools, right? Like, we see that happening and it makes sense. We think that that's all well and good, but when we measure the outcomes of that, does it end up being much more than people sitting around reluctant to be there, rolling their eyes? And again, I'm not by no means an expert on law enforcement, but this is just my perspective as a journalist. So again, to speak to like these different facets of policing or law enforcement, I spent a lot of time looking at I've spent a lot of time looking at police actions, police violence, et cetera. But especially after watching the series Philly DA, my focus has shifted more towards the system and the people who hold the decision to hold the power to make decisions about the policies, make decisions about the accountability, in particular prosecutors and the Division of Corrections and Rehabilitations that we have here, which oversee our jails and prisons. And sadly, in West Virginia, we don't see prosecutors stepping up to the challenge of holding police officers, correction officials accountable for the wrongdoings. So what ends up happening when you don't have somebody who is an elected official, you don't have somebody like a prosecutor overseeing the investigation or overseeing the prosecution of these crimes that happen in jails, that happen on the streets with police officers. You have civil rights lawyers, right, going after them. Well, that usually results, if the disposition of the case is favorable to the victim, that results in people getting payouts. They get settlements, and thank God, that's great for that family, right? They get some compensation for how they were wronged. But how does that change the system, right? When you have the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, when you have police departments that have city budgets backing them with that are insured for millions of dollars, I mean, where does that put the onus on the department to do better, right? I don't care if that's a police department or again, the Division of Corrections and Rehabilitation. And to me, that's where I feel that training, while it's good, if it's evidence-based and we're measuring the outcomes of it, that's great, but we need accountability. And with that being said, I think that's why I do the work that I do, because if the public doesn't know what's going on, how can we start to change hearts and minds about what needs to change within the criminal justice system?
Thanks so much for that. And now, before we have a fuller discussion, we want to hear from Larry Krasner. We were really excited to have Larry here with us tonight. I wonder, Larry, do you mind telling us a little bit about your administration and the work you're doing, and some of the forces for and against progress, and maybe how that what you've learned may have implications for West Virginia and other places?
Sure, I'd love to do that. And I really appreciate the comments that I've heard so far. I've done several of these panels for, the people who did the Philly DA series, and some of these comments are just very, very thoughtful and insightful. I really appreciate them. So just a couple of details. For those of you who don't know, it's a documentary. I had zero editorial control. I made no money off of it. The narrative form is striking because, 3 people essentially chased around several people in our administration with cameras for a couple of years and went through thousands of hours because they were looking at stories as they developed. They didn't know what the end of the story was or what stories mattered. And the episode that covers the Pownall case, Pownall being the officer, David Jones being the victim, in my opinion, that has to do with a case that's still going on right now. So I can't speak of it at great length other than to say, I'm sure you have the sense we're fighting very hard for justice and getting justice in the American criminal justice system when a police officer is accused. And by that, I mean on the rare occasion when a police officer is accused of a crime, is tough. We are supposed to have a system that is even-handed, that is rooted in equality. Not really. I mean, the truth is, in many ways, we have a system, and that, for example, Brian Stevenson has said is much better for guilty rich people than it is for innocent poor ones. And he's right. We have a system that in many ways is a caste system. Simply the culture around law enforcement, around policing, is a very hierarchical culture in which, in many ways, the whole system is kowtowing to police unions. And those unions are not run by their active membership. Those unions, if they're anything like Philly, are run by their retired membership. So if the whole system is being run by the retired membership of a police department, then what that's going to mean is a different era. The voice of the past is running that criminal justice system. In Philadelphia, needless to say, the retired membership is much more male, much more white. It is much more conservative because the police department in Philly has become somewhat more diverse. It is not being led by, for example, it's Black officers who have their own organization. They're retired. They are required to be members of the police union, but they are essentially subject to it because the police union is dominated by so many retired members that the truth is that the current leadership of the FOP in Philadelphia can be elected entirely by the retired membership with not a single current police officer favoring that particular leader. And that particular leader is frankly extreme and what you would expect. He is a huge supporter of Donald J. Trump in a city that despises Donald Trump. There has never been any person of color in the leadership of that union. And this is a union leader who has supported police officers visibly wearing Nazi tattoos while on duty. This is a leader who has invited the Proud Boys in to drink beers with the membership of the FOP in private areas of the FOP while simultaneously excluding all kinds of other people. I mean, that's a problem. It's a real problem. And it's a bigger problem when the whole system, the judiciary, becomes afraid of what it is that the police department represents. The district attorneys view their path to progress, their ambitions, their future career as being dependent upon the approval of the FOP. It becomes really serious. So make no mistake, when a chief prosecutor says we're charging a police officer who was in uniform and on duty with murder, there are consequences. We have done that twice in this administration. I don't say that out of any sense of pride. I say that because that's what equality requires. That is what a prosecutor's oath to seek justice requires. That's not what a caste system expects. That's not what a politics and a culture dominated like a caste system by the blue expect. But that's what we've tried to do. I think it is important also to remember that often police commissioners do not want what the head of the union wants. The police department, in theory, is run by a police commissioner. Many of them are modern. Many of them are integrity oriented. Many of them are trying to fire the right people, promote the right people. They're trying to do what is necessary for their organization, but their hands are tied by what have become these out of control, crazy union contracts. So what is part of the antidote to all of that? Because let's face it, there are a hell of a lot of good cops. There are a hell of a lot of good cops in Philly. They're just not the ones who seem to run the show, which is, I mean, we've all been around bullies. We know who ends up running the schoolyard. It's usually the bullies, unless they can be reined in. And in a system where there is no accountability whatsoever for bullies who are police officers, and that is the case in most jurisdictions, in that system, they will rise to the top. They will set the culture. They will be the role models. They will decide who's promoted. That is what happened in Philly for a very, very long time. It is my hope that by bringing an even-handed approach and actually pursuing justice in Philadelphia, we can change some of that. And we're trying to do a few things to do that. What does West Virginia need to do? I am not an expert in West Virginia, although I have been there. And I know that it is a fascinating place and complex. But one of the things you got to do is elect some progressive prosecutors. That may sound wild and unlikely, but my being here talking to you is wilder and unlikely-er. I was a complete political outsider at age 56 when I ran for the first time for anything in my life, won handily, and then won re-election by an absolutely enormous margin with all of the institutions against our administration and against us. And you can see in the Docuseries, which covers the first couple of years, what we stood for. They were all against us. The media, the mainstream media, largely was against us. The mainstream politicians, the people who run the Democratic Party, were so against us that they wouldn't even endorse me as an incumbent. The mayor wouldn't endorse me as an incumbent. The political party itself wouldn't endorse me as an incumbent, which was a very deliberate slap. And yet we ended up with 2/3 of the vote in the primary and nearly 3/4 of the vote in the general. I know it sounds like I'm bragging. I'm not bragging. What I'm telling you is that a very ordinary person, and that is what I am, and that is what we all are, did it. And you can do it, or someone you know who you know should have this power and should make these decisions can do it. That may sound aspirational. Let me give you a few facts. About 15 years ago, there were no progressive prosecutors. We could quibble, but let's just say no, because that's about right. None of the US lived in a jurisdiction with a progressive prosecutor. 2 years ago, before George Floyd, 10% of the United States population, about 35 million people, had elected, and in many cases re-elected a progressive prosecutor. And after George Floyd, it was 20.1%, almost 70 million Americans were in a jurisdiction where a progressive prosecutor had been elected and in many instances re-elected. Progressive prosecution from a political standpoint is more successful than the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. It is one of the most successful political events of the last few decades. And that is remarkable, because what I think it ultimately says is that people have had enough. And to the extent that people who are dissatisfied with their democracy, who feel like they are not represented, who are unlikely to vote, reluctant to vote, seldom vote, to the extent that they feel like criminal justice reform is on the ballot, they turn out and they vote every single time that our administration has been up for a vote. Primary 4 years ago, general 4 years ago, primary this time, general this time. Every single time, more and more voters have come out to vote. Again, this is not about me. This is about the reality that the crushing weight of mass incarceration, the sweeping injustice that has been experienced by decades of things like illegal stop and frisk, the alienation of communities that are supposed to be served rather than occupied, has become so great that people want it. Does the Republican Party get it now? Hell no, they don't get it now. Does the mainstream Democratic Party get it? Hell no, they're busy being Republican light on this stuff. They're all missing the point. This is not only immoral to continue as we are, it not only makes a lie of the notion that we're the land of the free, because we are, after all, the most incarcerated country in the world, more incarcerated than China and Russia and Rwanda. So how can we be the land of liberty? It's not just that. This is also stupid politics. Yes, there is someone you know who can win running against a long-term incumbent and can join a very, very long list of successful, frequently young, frequently Black, frequently female candidates who are winning these positions. I'm not the first one to get here. I learned a lot from Kim Foxx, who got to Chicago and won in Chicago before me. She's a lot younger than me, and she's a mentor of mine. Yes, you can do this. There are people in your community, and you probably can find them. There are people who have been death penalty lawyers their whole career. People who've been civil rights lawyers, people who've been defense lawyers, people who used to work at the DA's office and got disgruntled because they'd had enough of what it represented, who you need to bring in. And you can do it. You just have to have people willing to run. No, you don't necessarily need a whole bunch of outside money because the people are with this. So it's not everywhere. It's not all the time. But the amazing progress electorally of progressive prosecutors all over the country is telling us that the mainstream parties got it wrong. What the people want, even in a moment where there is a truly terrible crisis of gun violence, which we do have in the United States right now, even in that moment, what people want is not to go backward, they want to go forward. And going forward means that when police officers commit crimes, they're held accountable for those crimes. It means a few other things as well. But I want to stop talking because I want to make sure that I don't interrupt this program inappropriately. So thank you.
This was really great. And we're sort of moving into a time in the program where we can take some questions. And what I'd like to do is give the panel a chance to ask Larry any questions you have, and then we'll open up to some people in the chat.
Jim, would it be okay if I went ahead?
Yes, go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. I was reading an article, I believe it was by the Marshall Project, that talked about how in places where there are fewer than 1 million people, which is, jurisdictions like that, that's all over West Virginia, prosecutor races 50 to 60% of the time go unopposed, right? Because there's this culture of just the assistant prosecutor being groomed for the position and, kind of it feeling like an entitlement just being handed down. Is there any advice you could give to a place that is just made up of such small jurisdictions where we just constantly have these unopposed elections? Other than run, obviously.
Well, I think you hit on a key point. The record is actually even worse than that. It's almost 80 to 85% of all DA races or chief prosecutor races are unopposed. One thing that people in charge have done a very good job at is convincing you that you can't beat them. Oh, yes, you can. You absolutely can. There is something that goes with being especially a new candidate, someone who has not held office before. That means that the people you're up against cannot anticipate your moves. They don't know your creativity. They don't know where you're coming from. They generally underestimate you. So you absolutely can run against that. Look at Wesley Bell. Wesley Bell is the district attorney for St. Louis County, not the city, but the county, which is where Ferguson was located. Wesley Bell was a relatively young man, run against a 28-year incumbent, wasn't supposed to win at all, had minimal union support even, and yet he finished about 10 points ahead. Yes, you can do this. Look at Georgia. Right now in Georgia, there are about 8 or 9 smaller jurisdictions that have, in the last 2 years, elected progressive prosecutors, some of them quite young. Some of those jurisdictions are actually very small. Before then, you had Sherry Boston in DeKalb County, which is part of Atlanta, but they've gone from having kind of sort of one to having a whole organization. And it's driving the conservative leadership of the state so nuts, they're trying to come up with a committee to tell DAs what to do for the first time in the state's history, right? It's not just the big places, it's the smaller places too. And it matters a lot. My advice would be, don't believe the hype. They're not actually very good at what they do, and they're not very good at politics. If you're dug in with some community leaders, some activists, if you can gin up a little bit of support, you would be surprised what you can accomplish, because there's just too much complacency in going after incumbents.
Thank you. How about anybody else from the panel? Want to ask Larry a question before we open it up?
Yeah, I will, Dr. Nolan. Ms. Krasner, I was wondering if you could speak to what your office has been doing in post convictions, where you found that those convictions were marginal. I noticed that in one of the series that you were speaking about, that the men and women who you've overturned their convictions on because you recognize that the evidence was false, planted, or whatever it may be. Can you speak to that? I think we would like to hear more about that.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. You know, the story in law enforcement is not just about corruption in policing. It's also corruption in prosecution. There has been at least as big a vacuum of accountability among prosecutors for the longest time. And so at this point, my office is at about, I think we're at about 24 exonerations of people, nearly all people convicted of homicide, nearly all people doing a life sentence. I would, all but one or two, black. There was a lot of dirty stuff going on. There were, you know, the notion within the DA's office for decades was win at all costs, hide evidence. The surprising thing is they didn't destroy all of it, because when we came into office, we had access to those files. And one by one, as motions were filed, our conviction integrity unit, which was a unit in name only before us, went through those cases. We've got a, you know, right now we have a queue, we have a line of about 1,000 more cases to go through. And most of the time we do not find something that shows us that the conviction is wrong, at least not to the legal level that is required. But about 5% of the time, we found absolutely terrible, shocking things, nearly always pointing towards actual innocence. In certain other instances, we weren't so sure there was innocence, but there was outrageous misconduct in how the case was tried. Police misconduct in almost every case, prosecutorial misconduct in almost every case. You know, part of what this accountability means is that we have actually charged 3 detectives with perjury for their conduct in a trial that occurred about 5 years ago, where they told a bunch of lies after the first trial, where they told a bunch of lies. You know, there has to be this level of accountability. And it is just shameful to me the way the entire system has conspired to make people who lock you up for something you didn't do 25 years ago unaccountable through through delay, through statute of limitations, or through all kinds of different immunities, through apolitics and through laws and through jury instructions that just excuse every awful thing that was done. We are never going to have a system that is trusted in many of our communities unless we have people playing fair. It's just that simple. I don't know, why does it complicate? I mean, you know, and I'm not saying you're suggesting it's complicated, because I know you get it, Mr. Lester. But what I'm saying is that everybody takes it for granted that when you're playing baseball, you don't cheat. When you're playing football, you don't cheat. It was absolutely ingrained in the culture of the Philadelphia DA's office. And I know this from 30 years of having been a criminal defense attorney who was in court all the time against this office before I became DA here. It was absolutely basic to the culture to have no real compliance with turning over exculpatory information, meaning information that might show you were innocent or that might somehow support the defense. Absolutely standard that they didn't do it, that they buried it in the file, that the real perpetrators got away while innocent people went to jail. I mean, among other things, I'm not so sure they even viewed those defendants as being human. They really didn't. They didn't particularly care which black man they put in jail, to be blunt. I more or less heard people say things like that. They didn't really care. Their notion was that they had all done something wrong. We don't really care. They should do a bunch of time. Let's make sure we get some good headlines. I could go on and on because obviously it's very upsetting to me. But I will say this, I can't take credit for most of that work. Most of that work was done by a woman named Patricia Cummings, who I brought in from Texas, who had run a similar unit before, and she stayed with us for 4 years, did a marvelous job for 4 years. But I am by far, in many ways, behind. You know, if you look at Kim Foxx in Chicago and her team at this point have exonerated something like 140 people in the years she has been in office. There are often these little clusters of detectives who are really good at getting confessions from innocent people. We all know about the Central Park Five. Well, it seems to be repeat players who somehow get people who never committed a crime, never saw the crime committed, don't know a damn thing about the crime, to sign a piece of paper saying they did it, and to tell a story that is taken straight out of the head of a detective. That should tell all of us something. When you have almost 30% of people exonerated by DNA for homicides they never committed, confessing, then something is profoundly wrong with the system. And we need to have accountability, even if that means you got to lock up some prosecutors and make them do time, and you got to lock up some cops and make them do time. We need to have accountability.
Errol Randall, did you want to weigh in before we open this up? Errol, you there?
I was on the roll, but I was on mute. I apologize.
Sorry.
The other thing is just, you know, how do we address the police culture itself, and make it one that is inviting to diversity, that has accountability, and is true about training. And so those things are things that we have to address and be deliberate about. And because some of these things have to happen internally. Yeah, we can have the prosecutor hold us accountable, which is what we need. And I think that's what we all want. But how do we create a culture inside of policing itself where the bad apples stand out and are cast out? Because that's the challenge, and maintaining that.
Well, thank you for that question. I don't know whether to say Mr. Randall or Officer Randall, but thank you for that question. I really appreciate it. You know, so this is where we get to the heart of it. There really are a hell of a lot of great cops, and there's nothing they hate more than a corrupt cop. But they are often in an extremely difficult and compromised position. I have a lot of friends who are police officers, even more so when they are Black or brown officers. They're in an extremely complicated position where they're violating every norm by snitching or talking about illegal conduct done by their partner. They're violating every norm by admitting they saw the terrible thing that their partner did when he killed XYZ person. You know, it's a very, very difficult place to be. And I'm encouraged that people like you want to do what you can in terms of, you know, things like emotional intelligence, in terms of trying to help officers to understand what's happening in front of them instead of simply going to a very aggressive and sort of militarized response, which is somewhat in their training, somewhat in their tools. You know, I'm really proud to say that I was endorsed both times I ran by the Black Officers Association at the same time that I was the absolute villain to the FOP. There are, you know, it is a mistake to assume that all police are the same, feel the same, act the same, want the same things. There are so many of them in police departments, including commissioners, who really want things to be better. And no, it is not an answer to say, well, just elect DAs and they're going to fix everything. They're absolutely not going to fix everything. There are much deeper fixes that have to be there. How do we do it? Well, I think part of it is we got to come up with a better system than we have now for the police union contracts. We got to come up with unions that frankly aren't rogue. And I'm a huge supporter of labor, but the FOP in Philadelphia is a rogue union. I'll just give you one example. Right now in Philly, we're dealing with a terrible gun violence crisis. We got a pandemic going on. We got people dying massively from fatal drug overdoses, an epidemic I'm sure you're dealing with in West Virginia as well. And we have a level of police faking illness that is higher than any time in the history of the police department. We usually have 2 to 4% of the police department classified as injured on duty by doctors. We now have a system, because the contract's so out of control, where the police union picks the doctors. We have 11%. We've gone from 2 to 4% to 11% of police officers calling in IOD. And yes, some of them have some issues, but there's got to be at least 500-600 cops we're paying to stay home when they're perfectly healthy. They went out and got disability insurance, so they're getting paid twice. They're not even paying as much in taxes. And our local paper did an expose where they went to the homes of several of these officers, and they found that they were running businesses. One guy had a roofing business. Another guy's working in the family's linen business. He's supposedly too sick to move around. Here he is hauling bags of linen. Another dude's got his photo traveling all over the country with his softball team while he's supposedly too injured to show up for work. You know, this is just untenable. We have to have contracts that make sense. We can't have contracts where the issue is, can we lower the punishment for drunk driving in a patrol car. That happened in Philly. That was like an issue. They're negotiating in a contract. We have to have contracts that stand for integrity, that stand for accountability, that take care of police officers in a way that is appropriate, but is not rogue, is not crazy. And so much of this has to do with state laws that have come up with arbitration systems. So you don't have any kind of meaningful approach to how these contracts are written, and all of these things built in so that there really is no accountability. We got to change the way these contracts are done. We have to change the content of these contracts. We got to knock down some of the bad cops, because that is how you lift up the good ones. That is how you change the culture, by the best police officers being elevated to supervisory positions and setting the tone. And if we don't do that, at least in Philly, I cannot speak to West Virginia, but if we don't do it here, we're just going to be going down the same road for a long time. And many police commissioners with integrity are going to be frustrated because they can't really fire people, because they can't really promote people or move those people around in appropriate ways to protect the public.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. I better check with my co-moderators and see what's happening in chat. If you have some questions for any of the panel members.
Yeah, hi everyone. I just wanted to thank everyone again, all the panelists, for joining us tonight. We do have some questions popping up in the chat. The first question's from the audience, and it is directed at either Larry or Jim or Errol with your previous experience in law enforcement. During the Q&A portion of the episode that we just watched, we heard one of the police officers say to Mr. Krasner that the production goes down because the officers that work underneath him don't trust the current DA. I understand that we only have the context of what we say, but could any of you speak to what that individual might have meant in terms of production? Does that mean arrests?
In my experience both as a police officer and as a police researcher, production means lockups. The police see themselves as not as creating community safety, but arresting people, getting drugs and gun seizures and those sorts of things. And there's an illusion that the more lockups you can make, the more production you have, you can actually make places safer. But what actually happens is it becomes counterproductive. That it creates an atmosphere in a local place where people don't trust the police or the system, and they don't call the police, and they take matters into their own hands. And there's been decades of this going on, not only in Philadelphia, but all around the country. And so I think the notion of production, what do the police produce? They produce lockups. They don't necessarily solve crimes. I don't know what the clearance rate is in Philadelphia, but there are major cities in this country that have a 12% clearance rate on homicide. And this is just making an arrest. It's not getting a prosecution.
And I would agree with Dr. Nolan. You know, as far as activity, it means the number of tickets, because unfortunately, we rate the sometimes our departments see officers that are quote unquote successful, or the good officers are the ones that make a lot of arrests or write the most tickets, and so unfortunately that's not necessarily the case. So when they talk about their activity, they're talking about shutting down and not policing and letting things happen and not reporting and investigating with due diligence.
You know, I think those are great comments. I would just add to that, in Philly, you get paid a lot more if you make a lot of arrests, because when you go to testify and you're not on shift, you get quadruple overtime. There are people who make almost as much from testifying as they do from the regular shifts. So you financially incentivize making a ton of arrests. What do you expect people are going to do? Are they going to walk up and down a business corridor, checking in on all the business owners to develop relationships so they can get information, so they can find out before a shooting happens? Are they going to do that? Or are they going to stop every car? Are they going to do illegal stop and frisk, so that out of every 10 people they stop, maybe they'll find one with drugs, or they'll find one with something else illegal? People act as they're incentivized. And if you tell them what they're supposed to do is make lots of money by making lots of arrests and stopping people, then that will be their definition of productivity. And the point that both of you have raised is an excellent point. It breeds tremendous distrust. And so we end up in a situation where nobody in the community, when there's a shooting, really wants to talk to police about what they saw, where juries don't really trust testimony from police witnesses sometimes because they've had a couple of negative experiences in their life. You know, it's very, very counterproductive. It is the gift that Rudy Giuliani keeps on giving: illegal stop and frisk and these incentivized tactics to just bust everybody in sight, harass the same high school kids 4 times at a bus stop. And I know that a lot of police officers don't want that system because I talk to them and they tell me that. But once that becomes the system, once your effectiveness is defined as how many arrests you make, and the money that you're given, the promotions you're given are based on how many arrests you make, then you know what your job is. And that job is to make lots of arrests, even if it doesn't make anybody safer.
In the documentary, it was just interesting that the shoe was on the other foot when the officer was arrested. And they're like, how dare he not get bail? You know, it was just amazing listening to what I consider to be rhetoric. I mean, because it made no sense what he was saying, but the shoe was on the other foot. And it was just amazing how that was their argument when that happens all the time with cases that they're involved in.
Yeah. I'd like to touch on the fact of what you all are saying and what Mr. Krasner is speaking about. When we talk about that relationship, and we talk about community policing in that regard, you know, when a police officer shows up on a scene of like serious crime or a crime that has taken place and so forth, one of the first things that they're taught is to go look for witnesses, and that kind of thing. You wonder why you don't get those responses in communities like my own and those kind of things. Because there is no relationship. There's an adversarial relationship that has already taken place. When you come and ask, ask questions in those communities, those people are not willing to talk to you because they don't trust you and they don't believe in you and they don't believe what you're doing. It was just last week. You took my uncle to jail. You took my little brother to jail. You did this, you did that. That's what that productivity, that production kind of a thing produces. It produces an adversarial type of relationship, whereas the police officer are seen as invaders into that community. It's interesting because the police in general, are we getting safer communities? That's the question we need to ask ourselves. And the answer to that is no, they're not safer. Okay, they're not safer. Protect and serve for a certain segment of the population. So when we got police officers with militarized tactics coming into communities, you know, we've big city police officers, big city police departments and smaller police get tactical weapons, tanks, and all kind of armored vehicles. Why is that money not being shifted to schools and education? So we don't see that third grader now. We don't see him in juvenile court at 14. We don't see him in adult penitentiary at 18. You know, those are hard questions that we need to ask ourselves. We don't want to, you know, communities don't want to feel like they're being invaded, like this Gestapo tactics. Dr. Nolan and I was having a discussion at one time. We were talking about the image of the police officers that are put on television. We have this police officer, brawn and big, and he's, you know, forceful and aggressive and masculine and all those kind of things and so forth. And that's the image. And that can be terrifying. It can be terrifying. And so is there a softer, gentler approach? There's got to be a relational approach. Everything, I believe, begins with relationships. And if we fail to miss that point, whether or not it's relationship with the first grader, the first grade teacher, the kindergartner, teacher in school, any type of your parents, it produces a result in all of our lives. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. I guess I should ask Kyle if he wants to weigh in on this.
Well, I think that we have a couple questions that are similar to that Kyle will also be able to contribute to. So I just want to make sure that we are getting the questions that the audience asked. So I'm going to jump to that real quick.
Okay.
So let me minimize my screen real quick. So before I go with the next question, I just wanted to mention to the panelists, if anyone has directly sent you a message in the chat, if so, if you could just send that to Keely or myself, that would be awesome. And so this next question really kind of speaks to the culture of policing and what Darren had just mentioned as well. And this is open to any panel member. So what evidence is there that the police actually want to be held to different standards, which means giving up power and immunity and having much less freedom to harm people and possibly take lives. Specifically in West Virginia, or I should say in West Virginia and across the US, citizens of color are forced to figure out how to stay alive every single day. And we live our homes, and this is me directly saying from this, we leave our homes never knowing if today will be the day that we become the latest victim of police brutality, which in more cases or not, involves some level of systemic racism. There are so many arguments that could be made for abolition because we simply cannot wait for an entire culture to be completely overhauled. And so if anyone would like to speak to that in the panel, I open that to you.
I think that what's being said is being true. Is true when we talk about race in America. Why this is race in America? It's racism in America as it is, and the police department is no different than any other institution. And I think we need to start having those conversations. We need to start those discussions and recognize it for what it is, as opposed to acting like it doesn't exist. And so, and this is a great forum and a great platform to begin having that conversation. And so, I'm grateful for the question. I tell you that as my own experience, the only reason why I'm able to sit here and be on this panel right now is by the grace of God. There's been several times, many a times, that had not been for his protection and guidance, that I would have been dead in those streets, either by my own hands or by a police officer's hands. So I just gotta say, it's nothing special about me. It's just grace and mercy. Thank you.
Earl, you want to weigh in?
Yes, I do. I would just like to say, I don't think it's a situation where, the overall police department needs to be overhauled, because we do have the overwhelming number of police officers that work there are good officers. It's creating a culture that allows them to grow and to serve in different ways, and which might be different than what you see on TV, which includes embracing emotional intelligence. Our officers, we trained all of Charleston PD last year on emotional intelligence, and as a result, we're just talking right at a year. We're looking at use of force, and the trending for use of forces is going down. And right now, the numbers are looking at 25%. So giving the officers the tools, they never knew that they were weak in certain areas when it came to social awareness or relationship management. But once they were made aware, that gave them the ability to change by creating new muscle memory, working on those areas where they were weak. And they have embraced it. They don't want to be. The overwhelming number of police officers in police departments don't want bad cops on the police department. So we have to embrace that. But we also have to allow them to change, and give them the resources necessary to do it. So what's one of the plans that we need to do? Training divisions need to have a strategic plan in terms of what training looks like, not just making sure that you check boxes to achieve the number of in-service yearly credits that you need to achieve to maintain your certification. There's a big difference. We have to be deliberate. Again, I said this earlier in the presentation. Be very deliberate with what we are trying to achieve. So with training, there are certain classes I feel that need to be mandatory. There are certain policies that I feel that need to be mandatory across the state. They're not. The use of force policy in Charleston is different than the university. It's different than the use of force policy in South Charleston, and they butt up next to each other. The reporting of use of force is different from one agency to the next. So we have to be consistent. We have to have, these departments need resources also to have record management systems, be able to draw that information from, to be able to have a red flag system. Instead of just when something happens, then looking back, reactively. We need to be proactive in trying to figure out who's having issues. Okay. And then one thing that we're looking at with Charleston PD as well, We're looking at metrics, professional metrics and personal metrics to measure, to help our officers and help us understand the types of policing and type of internal and external customer service we're providing. We have to be different, but we also have to be deliberate in doing things that are outside the box. And not just use of force, but looking at, yeah, you might have an officer that does make a lot of arrests, but man, what does his disposition look like? What does his court appearance look like? Is he using pretrial diversions? Does he have the ability to think outside the box to help a person that he unfortunately had to arrest? Sometimes that happens, you have to, but that's not the end all. Can we use that opportunity to provide them resources? That's what emotional intelligence helps us to be able to do. Put ourselves in other people's shoes. So I'm challenging law enforcement agencies across the state as well as across the country. Engage upon emotional intelligence training that's going to help us to be well-rounded and be able to put ourselves in other people's shoes and again to be effective.
I've sat in, Mr. Randall was talking about Charleston and Charleston police, and a lot of my reporting has been on police has been done in Charleston, West Virginia. And, we can talk about, again, what the police are doing. And I think we should, I do it quite often. And some of the most egregious, shocking things I've seen from covering criminal justice reform all over the state, I'll be the first one to tell you, take place in Charleston with its police department. But that being said, where does the accountability come from, right? If you want to talk about reworking or reimagining policing, you have to expand that to just beyond what is Officer X, Y, and Z doing, right? A couple of years ago, West Virginia the state legislature passed sweeping bail reforms that we thought were going to address this process for once somebody is arrested, where do they go? What happens? Well, nobody's following that, and our jail populations just keep skyrocketing. And I've watched the Kanawha County prosecutor, Chuck Miller. I've watched his prosecutors request for maximum punishments for shoplifting, for things that people don't need to be in jail for to begin with. But I've also seen the magistrate sit right across from him and hand out a $50,000 bail in a state like West Virginia, where poverty is just through the roof. So there's just this big sweeping problem that doesn't just stop with the police. And in my opinion, the way to best engage that is through building democratic efforts to get these people out, to make sure that if the magistrates aren't doing their jobs, the Supreme Court knows about it and they're voted out. The prosecutors aren't holding people accountable, somebody else has to run, and that person needs to be voted out.
Great points. Anybody want to respond? I think, let me just add the point we've talked about accountability a bit. And again, in my research and my experience as a police officer, that there's a notion, it's easy to say because they're visible to us, that there's these bad apple officers and they're responsible for a lot of the problems, even if there's a lot of bad apples, and they need to be held accountable for sure. But if you look at almost every police department in the country, really, if you look at traffic stops, searches, seizures, arrests, every place, there's racial disparities, 2 and 3 times more likely. Black and brown drivers are 2 and 3 times more likely to be stopped. It's systemic in a sense that it's not just the bad apples creating the problem, that there has to be some accountability for what the police actually do. It's not just holding them accountable for making arrests, but how about holding them accountable for making places safe, for building trust in the system. So I just want to add that thought, that it may be bigger than just the enforcement piece of it. Any more on the chat, Danielle?
Yes, I think Keely is about to ask another question.
Okay.
Yep. So next question that we have from our audience is, directed at, I believe, directed at all panelists. This one's open to anyone. It says, curious to hear about second look sentencing and how Mr. Krasner or other panelists have seen it work best to get people serving long sentences released earlier.
Well, so we don't really have second look sentencing in Pennsylvania. We had to do more resentencing of juvenile lifers than any other city in the world, because Philadelphia put more juveniles in jail who were involved in homicides with life sentences or death sentences than any other city in the United States. And of course, this nonsense was not even done in other countries in the world. So that became a really interesting exercise. Let me be very concise in saying what happened there. What essentially happened there is over 100 of them were done by my predecessor, the prior DA. Over 100 were done by this administration. Our sentences were consistently shorter, on average about 10 years fewer, was where they came in. And most importantly, what we saw was that the level of criminal activity by juvenile lifers, people who were supposedly such monsters they should die in jail, the level of criminal activity after they were paroled, and you know, hundreds of them have been paroled statewide, is extremely low. Out of the hundreds of years that many of them have now been out and about in Pennsylvania, we've only seen 6 arrests last time I checked. The most serious one was for a 3rd degree, meaning lowest level felony robbery. That's essentially a purse snatching or a struggle where nobody gets hurt and you get away with the money. That was the most serious of them. There were only 2 convictions. It is accurate to say that if I walked out of my office right now, walked out on the street, and I put a rope around 100 people, whoever was out there, they would be a more dangerous bunch than the bunch of people who were supposed to have died in jail, but based on the fact that they were under 18 years of age when they were involved in the homicide, got a second look, as you would put it, got a resentencing. It's just a crucial point, and I think we all know what it means. It means that Brian Stevenson is right. You're actually not the worst thing you ever did. And this notion that we know exactly who somebody is, even if that person was involved in a truly terrible crime, is wrong. That, sure, there are some people who probably should stay in jail forever, but not many. And that are, you know, we have the most incarcerated country without having any justification for it. Germany has 1/9 as many people in jail, and they have 1/9 the level of homicide. This is Germany, a place where they engaged in genocide. They believed in violence. They believed in blood. They were racist, all of that stuff. And yet we find 75 years later, we find that that's the same country that has eliminated the death penalty, that gives everybody, no matter how bad the crime or how many crimes, a parole hearing after 15 years. That's the country which has 1/9 as many people in jail and 1/9 the level of homicide. Obviously, our view of sentencing is just wrong. The world is not made up of monsters and saints. It is made up of a whole lot of in between. And we have to change how we sentence people. We have to have systems to take a second look.
Absolutely. This is something that's really passionate for me because I know a lot of those guys. I know a lot of those men here who are in West Virginia prison system now, who have life without parole sentences, men who had committed crimes 25 years ago and, you know, and are still in prison and will never get out unless something changes within the courts or some type of laws even passed to get them a second look. And, you know, it's interesting because I wonder how many people who are listening now that are in their 40s now can say that they were the same person that they were at 18. Can say they were the same person at 19. West Virginia has a statute here that you can get life without parole for kidnapping. There's 2 statutes. The statute is, one is a 3 to 15. The other one is a life without parole. And that's solely up to the prosecutor of the case. It's his discretion how he charges you. I have a friend of mine, a personal friend of mine, who was a Marine for over 15 years, had never been in trouble before, started using crack cocaine and a drunken binge or a crack fueled binge. He took a car from a lady while she was still in the car. They charged him with kidnapping. They gave him life without parole, no prior convictions, none of that. Since he's been in prison, he's a model person, that guy of who he really is. Drugs doesn't make that person. The person does those things because of the drugs. Take the drugs out of the situation and you'll see the character of the person really shines. And nobody seemed to take that into account. And to decide the rest of his life was based upon a decision by not only his choice. We're not saying he didn't have to be punished, but life without parole.
And Darren, if I could just build on that, a couple of years back, the West Virginia legislature changed the recidivist life sentencing clause such that if you have two, not three, but if you have two possession with intent to deliver charges, or just two felony charges, one of which is possession with intent to deliver, you get a life sentence. You can get a life sentence. And who made that law? We can sit there and point fingers and say, well, it was a bad lawmaker. It was a prosecutor. It's a guy who was Ryan Weld, serves as a prosecutor and a delegate, as a senator, I believe, in the legislature. So again, voting and getting people engaged to pay attention to these sorts of things and get people into positions, it's important.
We are getting close to the end here, and I know there's probably more questions in the chat, but I wonder if before we leave, if any of the panel members have something on their mind that they didn't say or wanted to say, make sure that we heard before we sign off. It's open anyway.
I would like to say some closing words on my end. Just that policing is a difficult job, and it's one that we really have to even look at the mental health of the folks that serve. I did 25 years. That was enough. That was enough from the things that I saw and had to deal with and internalize. We have to have a mechanism that really addresses internal customer service as far as policing goes, because sometimes it translates in a negative way out in the community. So again, let's challenge ourselves to see how we can address and help those folks that are serving in that manner. We got to think about this as well. We have folks that are coming from we had a long war in Afghanistan, and when they come back to the civilian world, they become police officers. There's a different approach in the military than there is with policing, and all those things have to be thought about. We want to honor the veterans, but there's the use of force continuum is a little bit different when you're in an active war compared to on the streets of our communities. So just think different dynamics that we have to be conscious about. And I'll just end with this: pray that these officers make the right decisions. Pray for that they have strength to be able to speak against those that are doing wrong, and to make the profession an honorable profession. It's a family legacy for me. My dad was a police officer, retired. My brother's a police officer, retired. My sister's husband's a police officer, retired. So you come to one of my family reunions, everybody's packing. But what I'm saying is it was an honorable profession for us, one that I don't take lightly. And yes, we do need discipline. But I guarantee you, those folks that make up the bad apples is a small minority. But how do we encourage those that are doing the right thing to speak up and to really take over that culture? So let's just continue to have these conversations. And again, I appreciate everyone that has contributed.
Thanks, Harold. I want to, before, again, I want to give everyone a chance to say something. But Laurie Pompa from Temple, if we can get Laurie on board here.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes. There you
Good.
are.
Okay. So first, I just want to thank you all for having this tonight. I just think that these conversations are really, really important, and they're not easy. So one of the things that just struck me was the way that Errol said that he did 25 years. and very similar to, you know, how people talk about doing time in prison, and just how unfortunate that is. That, you know, I'm not sure how to put it. It's just a shame that, oh my God, I'm really stuck for words. That there's that feeling, there can be that feeling at the end of, you know, a career, that is it kind of almost like the sense of being released from prison. And I mean, I know that you know, everybody has difficult times. I'm sorry, I did not think this through before I said I wanted to say something. It just struck me. You know, we all have difficult times in our lives, but it would be nice if we could move in a more positive direction, you know, in what we do in terms of law enforcement and how we do it. Let me just stop there. So thank you all.
I think I appreciate it. I think when I talk about reimagining police, I think about, can you imagine like going into a community and people looking at the police and saying, oh, good, thank goodness you're here, you know, because you're going to help me. And when you end a police career, you think, wow, I did some good work there. But a lot of people are like, oh, Randall, they finish and they walk out and they're just, you know, they have PTSD for the rest of their life. And it's just a shame. We can do better.
I agree. You know, Randall, you talked about, you know, people coming back from, you know, different distant lands and war and those kind of things. And I think we'd be amiss if we're not really cognizant of the fact that, you know, there are wars that are going on in our neighborhoods and our communities. You know, whether or not we're talking about addiction, whether or not we're talking about street violence, whether or not we're talking whatever. And that's where the issue is, that we all suffer from some kind of trauma. And until we get on board with understanding what mental health is and remove the stigma of mental health and start making those type of resources available to people, I think that that thing there is a key component of how we act and how we behave and how we treat our fellow man. And so, you know, whether or not we're talking about police departments or whether or not we're talking about street gangs or whether or not we're talking about, I mean, pick your poison, whatever it is that you're talking about, is that people come from a place where they need help. And to just think that we can just, you know, take those people who are suffering through trauma and stick them into a place that creates more trauma on top of more trauma, put them back in our communities and expect different results. You know, we got another thing coming. This thing has been in place for so long, and this systems has been in place for so long, is that it becomes ingrained in our very fabric of our lives. And we all definitely could utilize, you know, to be better people, to recognize that people have problems, man. Police officer come to work, he's got problems. You know, the guy driving down the street that day, he's got problems. And so I think what you're saying is valid and true. And I will agree with you 100%. Prayer changes things. So I thank you for that.
Unfortunately,
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Just one last thing, because I don't want to leave the impression that when I retired that I was just totally frustrated with law enforcement. I wasn't. I just like getting a pension. And I've earned my pension, and so I can fish more. I can go to my daughter's cheerleading. So that's what I'm talking about. Because if it wasn't honorable for me, if it wasn't something that I appreciate, I wouldn't be here trying to maintain, you know, what is positive about policing, and to try to get it to change in a positive way. And to give voice to those that are doing the right things, and a platform to those folks who strap on that belt every day and serve well. So, but we do have challenges. We have to realistically approach them. And this culture that we're dealing with is hard to deal with. So again, I just appreciate all the diversity of the panel and your feedback, because it was well noted.
All right. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to give a special thank you to Larry Krasner. It was great having you with us and for your participation this evening and the work you're doing in Philadelphia. I also want to thank all the panelists for participating as well. Each of you provided important perspectives on the topic. And we hope we can move the needle on racial justice through policing and criminal justice reform. I want to acknowledge the great assistance of the co-moderators, Danielle and Keely, both graduate students at WVU. I also want to give a special shout out to Laurie Papa, the founder and director of Inside Out Prison Exchange Program at Temple, and Ted Passon for his incredible work putting this series together. So good night, everybody. Thank you.